Hello everybody, this is our Principles of Conservation lecture from Natural Resources class. So we're going to start it off kind of in the same context that we did last time with a quote from Aldo Leopold. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it does otherwise. I know we used this quote in the first lecture, but it is really important because what we're talking about today is the ideas behind conservation and what is a renewable resource and how did the thought process go about to change the ideas on how we manage natural resources in this country. And so I think this quotation really is appropriate for the conversation. But let's do it again. A land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. And so really to begin to understand the challenge of building this sustainable society that we're talking about, we really have to examine the resource base itself, and we really have to examine it from the eye of being a member of it, not the one in charge of it. We really need to understand ecology, understand what these natural resources are, and then once we understand them and we know their use and their place in the ecosystem, then we can start thinking about how we can help this ecosystem out. So we have some objectives for our conversation today. We are going to discuss renewable versus non-renewable resources. We're going to discuss the different approaches to natural resource management, and then we're going to try and understand the nemesis effect. So let's start out with the idea of a natural resource. So we said a natural resource was anything that comes from the earth that we use. So anything that we can take from the earth that we use. So natural comes from the earth, use, it's a resource to us. So within natural resources, we have renewable and non-renewable resources. Renewable resources are resources that if we use proper planning and management, their continued harvest and use can be done in perpetuity, because those resources will continually come back and be sustained with proper management. A non-renewable resource is a resource that no matter what, it will be exhausted or replenished at some exhausted or not replenished at some point in time. It doesn't matter even if you have the best and the most proper type of natural resources management. There's no way a non-renewable natural resource will stick around. It's just the idea that they will eventually run out no matter what we do. Whereas renewable resources, if we do it correctly and manage for it in the correct manner, they can be around in perpetuity. But renewable resources can easily become non-renewable resources without proper management. So we're going to break renewable resources and non-renewable resources down into categories. And so for our renewable resources categories, we have fertile soils, products of the land, products of the water, surface and groundwater, ecosystems, and energy resources. For our non-renewable categories, we're going to have fossil fuels, non-metallic minerals, and then metals. So let's start with renewable resources. The first one we have is fertile soil. And the idea of it being fertile soil is really important, because that speaks to the idea of the proper management aspect of it, because soil itself can become, just like any other renewable resource, can become a non-renewable resource if not managed properly. So when we talk about fertile soil, we're talking about soil that's productive, that can be planted in, things can be grown in it. And so that means that we need to understand that if we're going to use the soil, we want to use it and make sure we're managing it properly in order to keep it fertile. We have products of the land, so pictures here of both animals and plants. We're going to kind of group all of that into the category of products of the land. Anything that comes from the land that we use, so any wildlife, any domesticated animals, any plants, trees, all of those things are examples of products of the land. Products of lakes, streams, or oceans, we're talking about fish, we're talking about crustaceans, we're talking about invertebrates, we're talking about all the aquatic plant life and trees, moss, algae, all these different things that come from lakes, streams, and oceans. And certainly fish usually is the one thing we think of most when we think of products of lakes, streams, and oceans. But there's much more to it as well in terms of different things that that we categorize as natural resources that come from these areas. Our ground and surface water. So the idea of water being a resource, it's something that we need in order to survive. It's something that we sometimes take for granted because it's so available. But in certain areas, it's a real struggle to have water available, and not only water available, but water available that is clean and easily usable and easy to get. There are definitely areas in the world where that is a struggle. And so ground and surface water, we definitely consider to be a resource. Another one of our renewable resources is just the idea of ecosystems as a whole. And the reason why we want to throw ecosystems as a whole in here as its own category is because of the way that the ecosystem incorporates all these different things. And without the overall structure of the ecosystem, we'd have problems having clean water, or having products of the land, or having products of the lakes, rivers, and oceans, or having fertile soil if we're having other problems within the ecosystems. The ecosystems are such a unique assemblage that it just kind of requires its own category in terms of being a renewable resource. And then the last one, certain energy resources. So the idea of solar power, wind power, geothermal, tidal power, all these ways that we're using the natural resources that we have to create energy for us. Those would all fit into this category of energy resources in terms of renewable resources. And those are really kind of the larger categories, and we can pretty much fit all the natural resources that we have within those categories of renewable resources. And just to give you an idea, for California, in terms of the amount or where we get our renewable energy from, you can see that the majority of the renewable energy that we use comes from solar. The second highest one is wind powered. Then we've got a little bit of, we've got geothermal energy, we've got hydroelectric power, and then just by using biomass. So by growing woody plants and then using it for energy. And then, so those are our renewable resources, and then we have non-renewable resources. So the biggest non-renewable resource and the one that's most obvious to people is the idea of fossil fuels. And so the idea of gas, oil, coal, these natural substances that have been formed in the geologic past from the remains of living organisms. So if we're not clear on fossil fuels and the understanding of it, so it's the idea that things that have lived in the geologic past on this planet died and were worked their way into the soil, and while they've been into the soil and buried under the ground, they have this these substances that then we now have decided to harvest that are powering a lot of our machinery and our industrial ways. So our gas and coal, these are substances pulled from the fossils or the remains of organisms in our geologic past. Just to give you an idea of how hard it is to get some of these fossil fuels, here is a diagram of deep water drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see that they are going at a minimum down 8,000 feet to drill in terms of trying to get to these fossil fuels that are deep and buried away. And eventually they're going to try and really work their way all the way down to miles and miles under the sea. And so it's really interesting, the idea of how we get our fossil fuels and the lengths that we have to go through to get fossil fuels. Another way that we're getting fossil fuels is through hydraulic fracturing, or what's better known as fracking. And down here on the bottom right, I've got a video link. So pause the video and look at the PDF slides and take a look at that link. But the basic idea with hydraulic fracturing being the idea that we're injecting water, sand, chemical mixture at high pressure into the bedrock, and basically trying to create fissures to where we can then pump out the fossil fuel, really the natural gas, out of these fissures and be able to harvest it that way. So we're almost kind of trying to speed up the process. And fracking is something that has been controversial, and people just aren't sure of the long-term effects. And it's going to be interesting to see what we start to learn about the long-term effects of fracking. One thing to also note, because we talked about it with the last slide, is the idea of we're talking about going 7,000 feet down into the ground to be able to do this. So we're more than a mile deep into the ground. And so with this slide, the idea, it's hard because I'd rather just show you in person, but the idea of what happens to the land above with trying to get some of the fossil fuels out of this area. So if we think about the local area with Bakersfield, where do you see the majority of pump jacks? You see them down in the Kern River floodplain. And the reason for that is it's easy to drill out there. And the other reason that you see the pump jacks out there is you don't have to go, you're already down lower, being that you're in the floodplain, so you don't have as far to have to drill. And so they put the pump jacks out there in the Kern River floodplain. And what that's done is taken away from the natural resources of that area. Yes, we are getting use out of one of the natural resources in that area, which is the oil component of it. But in terms of when we look at the vegetation, when we look at what the Kern River is now versus what it used to be, we start to see that in order to to get to this one natural resource, this one non-renewable resource, we've had to sacrifice a bunch of renewable resources in order to do it. And so that sort of trade-off has kind of been something that's been a discussion point for environmentalists for a long time. Our second category of non-renewable resources is non-metallic minerals. So things like sulfides, lime, sulfur, halites, clay, gypsum, potash, things that end up being used in fertilizers or building materials. These are all non-renewable resources. These are things we're pulling out of the ground, and once they're out of there, it takes so long that it's really a non-renewable resources, because to get them to form again is such a long process that it just really becomes non-renewable. Here is an example of mineral deposits, so what they actually look like in Antarctica. So these are the types of things that when we say, oh yeah, well, we're pulling lime and sulfur and potash out of the ground, what does that actually look like? Well, this is what some mineral deposits look like in Antarctica. So it would be harvesting this rock and getting the minerals from the rock. Our last category of non-renewable resources is metallic minerals. So iron, copper, aluminum, lead, zinc, nickel, cobalt, gold, silver, platinum, all these things that we make jewelry out of, things that become important in terms of computers and cell phones and newer technology. All of these things, these metallic minerals, all are non-renewable resources, things that eventually we will run out of because the process to create them takes so long that it's not really going to come around again in our time. So the big idea between for starting this lecture talking about the idea of renewable versus non-renewable resources. One, for us to just get comfortable with the idea that when we say natural resources, what are we talking about and what are the differences between them? But then also trying to paint the picture of what we have to then say, these are the ideologies that we've used in the past to manage these areas, because what's really interesting is the idea that once we figured out what we have and what we needed and how to go get it, how did we then decide what we wanted to do? And so we went through basically four main ideologies. We've gone through exploitation, preservation, utilitarian, and ecological. So let's dive into each of those. So we've talked about exploitation before, but it was the period of the early to mid 1800s, very human-centered, focused on short-term profits because we had ignorance or disregard for the idea of future availability, which really just stemmed from a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge of how ecology worked, and the idea of looking at these natural resources like they were never ending, that they could never be exhausted, and only to find out that they could. And really that stems from a lack of guiding principles and not really having any knowledge as to how these natural resources worked. So then usually anytime you have it where you make a mistake, the way you try and correct is you end up overcorrecting. And so what we ended up doing was then getting into an era of preservation, which I think for the time was actually good. It was very nature-centered. The resources then became preserved. This is the time where we started establishing national forest reserves. We started having national wildlife refuges. We got the establishment of national parks, of some wilderness areas during this time. And so we really said, look, we're wasting all this stuff. We've used it all up. We've damaged some of these areas. Now let's start saving areas. So we went from just tearing the place up to now let's save as much as we can. And so what we needed to do then is kind of then go to an approach in natural resource management where we kind of balance out. And that's where we came up with utilitarianism and the utilitarian approach, which was championed by Gifford Pinchot under the idea of the wise use paradigm, and following along with that slogan of the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. We want to manage the resources for sustainability, and we want to harvest at rates sustained by growth. So we really want to look at what we're doing and how we're doing it, and making sure that we can plan to have it around for future generations. But the only real problem with utilitarianism is that it was single resource centered and a little bit centered more skewed towards humans. So in our first approach, our exploitation approach, it was very human centered. In our second approach, it was focused solely on nature and making sure nature was getting taken care of. Then in this third approach, we go back to the idea of being a little more human centered, and that has led us to trying to wonder do we have this perfect balance? Because we had exploitation, which we know did not work out really well. And then we had preservation, which was good in that we got our national forests, we got our wilderness areas, we got our national parks, but now we have these areas set aside, but now we need to manage them, and now we need to figure out how to use them best. So does utilitarianism really balance it out? And it does to a certain point, but only for a little bit, because it's only looking at, it's single resource centered. It's only looking at one thing at a time, basically. So if I take forestry as an example, we're focused on the idea of timber production. But when we're focusing on timber production and trying to do timber production as wisely as we can, we're not focusing on the idea of, how does that affect the wildlife, and how does that affect the water quality, and how does that affect the air quality, and how much pollution are we putting into the atmosphere? And so it's a good approach, but it wasn't quite fully developed in terms of an all-around approach. And so that takes us to the ecological approach, or ecosystem management is the terminology you'll hear these days. It still embodies the wise use paradigm, still believes in the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run, and the idea of sustainability, and for the idea of trying to use resources wisely. But the ecological approach focuses on multiple use and multiple resources in the approach. It wants to consider all the different aspects. So when I'm doing a timber harvest, I'm not just thinking about, okay, I'm going to take this stand of trees, I'm going to cut it down, and then I'm going to grow another one. And we're not just looking at the land in that way. How is that going to affect the soil? How is that going to affect the species diversity? How is that going to affect the wildlife in the area? How is that going to affect the water quality within the area? How is that going to affect the air quality within the area? We're looking at all the different parts of the ecosystem. And the big reason for kind of this shift from utilitarianism to the ecosystem management is the idea that all these things are interconnected, and all of them will have an effect on the ecosystem and on any parts of the ecosystem. And if we start changing parts of the ecosystem then changes. So we have to understand that everything that we do within an ecosystem in terms of management is going to affect the whole ecosystem. Therefore, if that's the case, we need to look at the whole ecosystem and manage for the whole ecosystem if we can. Now, that's hard. And there's no easy way to say that. That's hard. That takes a lot of thinking, a lot of planning, a lot of studying, a lot of science to really understand all the different parts that go into that sort of thinking. But it's necessary in order to do it right. And so when we think about the idea of ecosystem management, the idea of managing for ecosystem sustainability rather than just for the harvested resource, we need to think about our basic ecological issues, but then we also need to think about institutional issues such as laws or governing bodies or the anything that the if it's federal or private or state or and whatever laws, rules, regulations that we have to deal with, and then also socioeconomic issues. How does this affect the people? What values and interests and assets are there? It's trying to take into account everything, not only within the ecosystem itself, but every aspect that the ecosystem is going to kind of basically play a part in. Everybody who's got a stake in that ecosystem needs to be at the table in order to do ecosystem management correctly. But that makes it extremely difficult. But just in case that's not kind of clear, I brought up this graphic right here because I think it kind of helps paint the picture. So when we think about utilitarianism, it's more like this first part of the graphic over here on the left, single species or sector. So I can really manage well sorry about that. I can really manage well for oil in an area that I'm at. Let's just say it's off the California coast. Or I can manage for certain species of fish really well. I can even do multiple species of fish really well, or I can do the oil industry and the fishing industry. But if I really want to think about the ecosystem of the California coast and really want to manage completely for the ecosystem of the California coast, I want to think about climate and weather and possible issues with climate change. I want to think about all the different fish species that will be affected by my management decisions. I want to think about the fishing industry being affected by my decisions. I want to think about the oil industry being affected by my decisions. I want to think about the aquatic plant life that'll be affected. I want to think about the energy resources that I could be getting from that area and how they're going to be affected. I want to think about the human part of it. I want to think about the whaling, the whales, and their role in the other parts of the ocean that are farther off and not just right along the coast. And I also want to think about how this is going to affect the locals within the city who are affected by that ecosystem right off the California coast. So there's a lot more to think about when you're trying to do ecosystem-based management than just the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. It's almost like you say the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run while making sure that we think about everything that could happen and everything that could be affected in this ecosystem. And that leads us to the idea of the nemesis effect and the importance of trying to understand a really complicated subject. The nemesis effect is described as unexpected environmental outcomes that result from the interaction of several management changes or resource problems. And the idea behind the nemesis effect is just really trying to understand that when we look to change something in an ecosystem, because there's so many things linked together in an ecosystem, that anytime we go to solve a problem, we might create another unforeseen problem that we didn't even consider. And so going back to something we talked about in the first lecture was the idea of Yellowstone in the 1920s, and the idea that they said, oh, well, we want to get rid of the gray wolf because it's causing problems for us. nobody thought and nobody understood that if you get rid of the gray wolf, that's going to down the line affect the beaver population, and then the beavers won't create dams, and then those dams won't create all these freshwater areas, and then all these other species in the park are going to die or move away because they don't have a water source anymore. That wasn't understood. That's the idea of the nemesis effect, that just because you're solving a problem, okay, the wolves are problematic, well, let's kill all the wolves. Just because you solved the problem doesn't mean you didn't create another problem, and another problem that might even be worse than the problem that you started out with. And even a solution to something could be just as problematic as a problem. And so it's just the idea of understanding that with high levels of complexity, because everything is intertwined, you really want to make sure that you try and think of all the different things that could be affected. And it even goes down to thinking about the future and saying to yourself, if we make this decision, what happens 5 years from now? What happens 10 years from now? What happens 100 years from now? What happens 200 years from now? To really try and get out all that might possibly happen. Because even what seem like simple solutions or things that totally make sense could be problematic one day. I think a lot of the pollution, a lot of the problems we have in terms of natural resources haven't been done maliciously. Believe me, there's definitely people out there who are maliciously harming the environment. They know they're harming the environment and they just don't care. That's definitely true. But I think a lot of this has just been people who have a lack of understanding, or people who have a lack of foresight to think these things through and really take a management approach that really considers all the different aspects that might happen. Another example that I like to think of is environmental groups who protest logging and don't want areas to be logged, but don't have a good understanding of disturbance ecology, which we're going to talk about in our ecological principles section. And understand that the land that those trees are coming off of actually needs some sort of disturbance. So if we're not going to log those areas, well, then they need to be, we need to use prescribed fire, or we need to do something else, because these areas they need a disturbance, and a disturbance will happen one way or another. So in the Intermountain West, so the areas like Wyoming, Idaho, Colorado, these areas where you have the Rocky Mountains, they've not been logging lately, and we've also suppressed fire in these areas. So we've kept out disturbance. So what has happened? We've actually ended up with a huge pest problem, to where the mountain pine beetle now has gone and killed millions and millions upon millions of trees, and now there's these huge swaths, miles and miles of dead trees in the Rocky Mountains, and now it's an extremely complex problem. And if you think to yourself and you say, oh, well, people were doing what they thought was right to protect these places and keeping them from getting logged, and we don't want fires because we don't want people's houses burning up and all that, it can be problematic if you don't understand the consequences and you don't understand how it's going to affect the whole ecosystem. So it's really important to understand ecosystem-based management, really important to understand all the complexities involved, because it's hard to manage for these problems and these things that you might not even think are going to be affected, but can, due to the nemesis effect. And it's really just really the idea of there are probably, more than likely, no matter whatever decision you make, there's going to be some sort of unexpected problem. But if we've done the research, we've done the science, and we put our best effort out there to do our best job in terms of ecosystem management, more than likely that problem is going to be something smaller and easier to mitigate, rather than being some huge complex problem that we that maybe is even worse than the problem that we began with. Oh, went too far. There we go. And the reason behind the nemesis effect, the ecosystem is not simply the sum of its part. It's extremely complex. Everything is intertwined and interconnected, and complex environmental interactions are not easily understood. The way everything interacts and the way everything is interconnected is complex and requires research and requires really it requires a generalist approach where you really have to know a lot about a lot of different things, or at least a little about a lot of different things, in order to really be able to collaborate enough or get enough people in the room with enough different expertise in all these areas to really try and make the best decisions possible. And that sometimes gets tricky because we all have our own inherent bias and our own interest that we represent. So it can get pretty complicated, but that's why managing natural resources is hard. It's not easy. If it was, we wouldn't have so many issues that we do currently. So it's just something to think about, and kind of just leave you with the idea that if we're going to operate under this ecological approach or this ecosystem management approach to natural resources management, then we need to understand basic ecological concepts. So that's what we're going to talk about in our next lecture.